There are 31 chairs in room 214 of the Ambrose Hall English building, and on a gray Tuesday morning 15 years ago, one of them had 2 people trying to sit in it. I wasn't there. I want to be honest about that up front, because everything I'm about to tell you, I only know secondhand, filtered through a girl named Talia who called my girlfriend crying with laughter, actual relief laughter, the kind that comes out sounding like sobbing, 20 minutes after it happened. But I know it the way you know the ending of a story you wrote yourself. Because I had written it. 11 days earlier, sitting at a beige desk in the administration building with a headset clamped over one ear, I had erased a boy named Derek Voss from every classroom he was supposed to be sitting in. Talia told it like this: the professor, a soft-spoken adjunct named Mr. Halloran who took attendance the old-fashioned way, off a printed roster, looked up mid-roll call at the extra body standing in the back because there weren't enough desks, and asked the young man's name. Derek Voss, he'd said, probably a little embarrassed, probably assuming a mistake. Halloran ran his finger down the page. Up. Down again. I don't have you on my list. There's some error. I've been in this class since August. I'm sure it's a clerical thing, Halloran said, the way professors say things when they don't actually know and don't especially want to find out. But I can only let students on the official roster sit. I'm sorry, you'll need to sort it out with the registrar. Derek didn't sort it out with the registrar. Derek couldn't sort it out with the registrar, because there was nothing to sort. As far as the registrar's system was concerned, Derek Voss was not enrolled in a single class that semester. He hadn't been dropped by accident. He'd been dropped, and then quietly, deliberately, re-enrolled in 6 different sections that were guaranteed to cost him money he didn't have the standing to spend on classes he had no intention of attending, lab fees, materials fees, a private music lesson slot that ran $400 a semester. Classes he would never once set foot in. All of it engineered so that if he tried to unwind any of it, he'd hit a wall of unpaid institutional debt that would freeze his transcripts, his registration, and his standing, all at once. A waitlisted student, a nervous freshman who'd been checking the portal every morning for 2 weeks hoping a seat would open up, took the one Derek thought was his. He never sat in that class again. I want to rewind now, because you deserve to know how a mild-mannered 20-year-old community college kid with a part-time clerical job ends up doing something like this to another human being. I promise you it wasn't hatred, at least not at the start. It was math. It was a very simple equation that had been building for 2 months, and Derek Voss solved the last variable himself the night he put his hands on someone I loved. If you've ever watched someone you care about get hurt and felt the particular, useless fury of having no legal way to fix it, you already know exactly where this story is going. I should tell you a little about who I was back then, because it matters later. I was 20 years old, a sophomore at a junior college in the Central Valley, working 18 hours a week in the registrar's office to help cover rent on the apartment I shared with my girlfriend, Renee. We'd moved in together at the start of the semester, nothing dramatic, just 2 19-year-olds doing the math on what 2 rents versus 1 rent looked like, and deciding the second option made a lot more sense. I was, by nature and by necessity, the reliable one. Not the loud one, not the fun one, though I could hold my own at both, the reliable one. The guy who remembered which of his friends had a 9 a.m. final and which one needed a ride to campus because their car was in the shop again. The guy who filled out his own financial aid forms without being asked twice, and then filled out 2 friends' forms the same week because they kept getting confused by the FAFSA verification worksheet. I picked up the registrar job specifically because I was good at exactly this kind of thing, patient, careful, unbothered by repetitive detail work that made other student employees want to gouge their eyes out. I liked systems. I liked knowing how they worked, and I liked being the person who could make them work correctly for people who didn't know how to ask. It's a small thing, being the reliable one. It doesn't feel like power. It mostly just feels like a personality trait that occasionally gets you free pizza when a friend needs their essay proofread by midnight. But reliability, when it's paired with access, real, unglamorous, bureaucratic access, becomes something else entirely. I didn't know that yet. I was about to find out. I'd gotten the registrar job almost by accident. A flyer on a corkboard outside the financial aid office, promising $10 an hour and flexible student hours, which turned out to mean whatever 3-hour block nobody else wanted. I interviewed with a woman named Ms. Kowalczyk, a records supervisor who'd worked at that school for over 20 years and who, I would later learn, ran her department with the quiet, unglamorous authority of someone who genuinely believed a clean, accurate student record was a kind of moral good. She asked me exactly 2 questions in that interview. The first was whether I could alphabetize a stack of folders without getting distracted. The second was whether I could keep my mouth shut about what I saw in them. I answered both correctly, apparently, because she hired me on the spot, sat me down at a beige desk with a boxy monitor and a headset, and spent the better part of a week walking me through the enrollment system, how to process an ad, how to process a drop, how to read a hold code, how to verify a student's full-time status for a scholarship or a loan or, though she didn't dwell on it long, an immigration document. It was not exciting work. Most of my shifts were spent processing the same 6 or 7 kinds of requests over and over. A student who'd missed the first 2 weeks of a class and needed to be dropped before it tanked their GPA, a parent calling to ask why financial aid hadn't posted yet, a printer that hated Tuesdays specifically. But I was good at it, in the unglamorous way some people are good at crossword puzzles or filing taxes. I liked that every student had a file, and every file had a shape, and if you paid attention you could usually tell, just from the shape of it, roughly what kind of semester someone was having. I liked systems. I liked being trusted with them. And somewhere in those first few months, without ever really deciding to, I built a private, specific kind of expertise. I knew, better than almost any other student on that campus, exactly how the machinery of enrollment worked, and exactly what it could and couldn't survive. Renee and I had a good, uncomplicated life that fall. Small apartment, mismatched furniture from her parents' garage, a couch we were both a little too proud of because we'd bought it ourselves. A few weeks into the semester, she told me she'd invited a friend from one of her classes over for game night. That friend was Talia. Small tip, if you're new here, hit subscribe now, because the version of me in part 2 is not the version of me you're going to meet by the end of this story. I remember opening the door that first night expecting a stranger and getting a small shock of recognition instead. Talia and I had gone to the same high school. We weren't close, different friend groups, different lunch periods, but we'd been in enough classes together over the years to have that easy, low-stakes familiarity you build with someone you've simply existed alongside for a long time. She laughed when she saw me. "Of course," she said. "Of course it's you." It turned out to be one of the best game nights we'd had in months. Talia was funny in the specific way that quiet people are funny. She'd sit back through 3 rounds of a card game saying almost nothing, and then land one perfectly timed line that would have the whole table wheezing. Renee liked her immediately. I liked her immediately. By the end of the night it felt less like Renee had made a new friend from class and more like all 3 of us had just been introduced to someone we'd apparently been missing. After that, Talia became a fixture. Dinner on Wednesdays. Movie nights on the weekends when none of us had anywhere better to be. She had a key code to get into the building within a month, mostly so she could let herself in if she beat us home. It wasn't a big, dramatic friendship. It was the good, ordinary kind, the kind you don't notice building until you realize you can't picture your week without it anymore. She brought her boyfriend around a couple of times in those first weeks. I'll call him Derek. He was polite in the technical sense, he said please and thank you, he didn't put his feet on the furniture, but every single time he sat on our couch, the temperature of the room dropped by 10 degrees. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was short, clipped, and usually aimed at redirecting the conversation back toward Talia, where she'd be later, who else she'd talked to that day, whether she'd finished some errand he'd apparently asked her to run. He watched her more than he watched anyone else in the room, in a way that didn't read as affection so much as inventory taking. Nobody said anything out loud. But after his second visit, Renee and I had the kind of wordless exchange that happens between 2 people who've noticed the same uncomfortable thing at the same time and are silently agreeing not to bring it up yet. He came a third time, made an excuse to leave early, and after that, he mostly stopped coming at all. Talia never explained why, and none of us pushed. I didn't think much more about it. I had no reason to yet. What I remember more clearly than Derek, honestly, is how quickly Talia became someone whose absence you'd notice before you noticed her presence, the kind of friend who becomes load-bearing in your week without you ever formally agreeing to it. She had a standing seat at our little two-person kitchen table that somehow became a three-person table without anyone buying a third chair. She just pulled one in from the living room every Wednesday like it was understood. She kept a mug at our place, a chipped blue one with a cartoon fox on it that she'd won at some campus carnival, and got genuinely annoyed if she came over and someone else had used it. She and I fell into an easy rhythm of ribbing each other about our overlapping high school years, the kind of shared history that lets you skip past the getting-to-know-you phase entirely. She remembered a mortifying incident involving me, a marching band uniform, and a bee, that I had spent 4 years successfully pretending nobody else recalled. I remembered that she'd once organized an entire underground petition to get better vegetarian options in the cafeteria and gotten actual results, which told you everything you needed to know about how stubborn she could be when something actually mattered to her. That stubbornness is part of why, later, it took me so long to understand how someone that capable, that sharp, that willing to organize a cafeteria revolt over principle, could end up flinching at her own phone. I didn't have the vocabulary for it then. I do now. It has nothing to do with intelligence or strength and everything to do with how slowly and quietly that particular kind of control gets installed, one small concession at a time, until the person living inside it can't always see the shape of the cage from where they're standing looking back, and this part one only understand now, 15 years and a compliance certification later, having sat through more workplace trainings on interpersonal misconduct than I can count. The signs were all there, just not in a shape any of us had the vocabulary for yet. Talia would occasionally show up later than planned, phone buzzing in her pocket the entire time, and glance at it with a small, tight flinch before silencing it without reading it. She stopped mentioning her weekend plans until after the weekend had happened, like she'd learned it was safer to report on her life retroactively than to announce it in advance. Once, when Renee asked offhand if she wanted to grab lunch on a Thursday, Talia hesitated just half a second too long before saying yes, like she was running a calculation neither of us could see. None of it, on its own, was a red flag you could point to. That's the thing about the pattern nobody names. It isn't one loud moment. It's 100 small ones, each easy to explain away individually, that only add up to something alarming when you finally step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. We didn't step back far enough. Not until we didn't have a choice. It was a Thursday, close to 11 at night, when Renee's phone rang and it was Talia, and she was crying too hard to get a full sentence out. "Come over," Renee said, already grabbing her keys. "Right now. We'll come to you, or you come here, whatever you want, just come over." Talia came to us. She was at our door 20 minutes later in sweatpants and a jacket that wasn't hers, mascara tracked halfway down her face, and it took almost 10 minutes of Renee holding her on the couch before she could tell us what happened. Derek had shown up at her apartment that evening upset. He'd seen a text on her phone from Renee about dinner plans and decided it was evidence she was cheating on him. He never specified with whom, and honestly, in the moment, it didn't seem to matter to him. He needed a story where she was betraying him, and any available detail would do. He started in on her the second she opened the door, every name in the book, according to Talia, the kind of language designed less to communicate an idea and more to make someone feel small enough to stop arguing. When she tried to walk past him to leave, just to leave, to put a locked door between them and cool off, he shoved her. Hard enough that she went backward over the coffee table in her own living room and landed wrong on her hip and lower back. She showed Renee the bruise later that night in the bathroom, and Renee told me about it afterward with her hand pressed flat against her own mouth like she was trying to keep something from coming out. A deep, spreading purple-black bruise the size of a dinner plate. Talia swore, over and over, that it had never happened before. That he'd never put his hands on her, not once, that this had to be some kind of horrible, unrepeatable accident brought on by a fight that got out of control. I believed that she believed it. I still don't know if it was true. She kept circling back to the same handful of details, the way people do when they're trying to talk themselves into a version of events they can live with. He'd apologized immediately, she said, the second she hit the floor, dropped to his knees next to her, said her name over and over, said he didn't know what had come over him. He'd wanted to drive her to urgent care and she'd refused, because going to urgent care meant filling out a form that asked how the injury happened, and she wasn't ready to write down an answer to that question, not even a vague one. So instead she'd sat on his bathroom floor with a bag of frozen peas pressed against her hip while he apologized in increasingly smaller, more desperate sentences, and somewhere in the middle of that, she'd found her keys and left, and instead of going home, she'd come to us. Renee ran her a bath. I remember standing in the hallway outside the bathroom door for a long time, not because I needed to be there, but because I didn't know what else to do with my body. I could hear the water running and, underneath it, Talia's voice, low and unsteady, telling Renee things I wasn't meant to hear and never asked about afterward. When she finally came out in an old t-shirt of mine that Renee had grabbed from our closet, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, not physically, just diminished somehow, like whatever confidence usually sat on her shoulders had been temporarily set down somewhere she couldn't reach. What I knew, sitting on our living room floor at midnight with my back against the couch Talia was curled up on, was that something in me had gone very cold and very still. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't yelling. I remember being almost eerily calm, the way you get when your brain quietly decides that whatever happens next, it's going to be handled. I am not a violent person. I've never thrown a punch in my life. I'm a big guy, 6'3", built like someone who played line for a season and then quit, and I have never once used that size for anything except carrying too many grocery bags at once. So the fantasy I had that night, the one where I drove to Derek's apartment and did something with my hands that I'd regret, evaporated pretty fast. It wasn't who I was, and more practically, it wasn't going to help Talia even a little. But something else was going to happen. I just didn't know what yet. Talia didn't want to call the police. I want to be careful here, because this is a decision I've thought about for 15 years, and I've come to understand it a lot better than I did at 20. She was scared of what would happen if she reported it, scared he'd retaliate, scared of dragging it into something bigger than she could control, scared, honestly, of 100 things that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the particular fear that lives in your body after someone you trusted puts their hands on you. She broke up with him the next day, over text, from our apartment, with Renee sitting beside her the whole time. And then she asked us, quietly, almost apologetically, not to do anything about it. Just let her handle it. Just let it be over. We said okay. What else do you say? But okay didn't sit right in my chest. For the next several days I went to my classes, went to my shift at the registrar's office, came home, and underneath all of it I had this low, constant hum of this can't just be nothing. Not because I doubted Talia's right to handle her own life, I didn't, and I still don't, but because I understood, in a way I couldn't fully articulate at 20, that let it be over and actually be over were two very different things when it came to a man who'd already shown he'd put his hands on her once. She still had a class with him. English 1B, Tuesdays and Thursdays, room 214. She mentioned it once, almost in passing, and then flinched at her own sentence like she wished she could take it back. I brought it up with Renee one night after Talia had gone home, both of us lying in the dark not quite ready for sleep. It doesn't sit right, I said. Just letting it be nothing. It's not nothing to her, Renee said carefully. She's the one who has to live in it. If she says she wants to handle it herself, that's her call, not ours. I know that. And I did know it, genuinely. I wasn't arguing that we should override Talia's wishes, drag her to a police station against her will, make a private decision public before she was ready for that. That's not what was eating at me. What was eating at me was smaller and more specific, the fact that handling it herself mostly seemed to mean absorbing it, rearranging her schedule mentally around the shape of him, learning to walk into a classroom braced for impact twice a week, while he got to walk into that same room without having to brace for anything at all. That asymmetry was the part one couldn't make peace with. She was the one doing all the adjusting. He wasn't adjusting for anything. I didn't have a plan yet, not really, not that night. What I had was a low, persistent hum of unfairness that I couldn't talk myself out of, no matter how many times I reminded myself it wasn't my decision to make on her behalf. I kept thinking about the specific unfairness of it, that the person who did nothing wrong was the one rearranging her whole life around avoidance, while the person who'd shoved her into a coffee table got to keep his Tuesday through Thursday schedule exactly as it was, showing up right on time, roster and all, like nothing had happened. That was the moment the equation in my head finished solving itself. If you've ever sat with that specific, helpless feeling, knowing something is wrong and having no clean, legal lever to pull to fix it, stay with me, because I found one. It just wasn't the lever anybody expects. Here's the part of my life that made all of this possible, and it has nothing to do with hacking or breaking into anything. I want to be clear about that, because the truth is much more boring, and much more damning, than anything dramatic. I had a student job in the registrar's office. Legitimate access, given to me by the school, to do legitimate work, processing add/drop requests over the phone for students who called in, verifying enrollment for financial aid checks, printing transcripts for graduating students. It was tedious, unglamorous, entirely ordinary work. And because it was ordinary, nobody thought twice about a student employee having his hands on the system for hours at a time. I knew, because it was part of my job to know, that the semester had a hard drop/add deadline, the last day a student could change their schedule without academic or financial penalty, and after which any change required a dean's signature and a very good reason. I knew that Derek was an international student, because I'd processed his enrollment verification for a visa-related request earlier that semester without thinking anything of it. It was just a name on a form, one of 40 I'd processed that week. And I knew, because our office ran an annual training on it, that international students on an F1 visa are required to maintain full-time enrollment, a minimum number of credit units, to remain in lawful status. Fall below that number without an approved exception, and your ability to legally remain enrolled, and in the country, unravels fast. 12 units. That was the number. 12 units between being a student in good standing and being nothing at all, in the eyes of the system. I didn't plan any of this in a single dramatic moment. It built over about a week, the way bad ideas do when you keep circling back to them because some part of you has already decided you're doing it and is just waiting for the rest of you to catch up. The last day to drop or add classes without penalty fell on a Friday. I'd been scheduled for a shift that day for months, pure coincidence, or maybe not, since I might have quietly made sure I was on the schedule once I saw the date circled on my own calendar. I want to describe this part carefully, because it's the part I've turned over in my head more than any other, in the years since. It wasn't clever. It wasn't some elegant hack. It was a headset, a phone line dedicated to processing student schedule changes, and a system I had legitimate, authorized access to use for exactly this purpose, just not for this reason, and not for this student, without his knowledge or consent. I pulled up Derek's student ID. I had his full schedule in front of me, 6 classes, all standard units, all things a normal full-time student would be taking. I dropped every one of them. Then I went back in and enrolled him, using the same access, the same legitimate system, into 6 brand new sections. Not empty seats in random classes. Very specific ones. A private applied music lesson slot that carried its own separate lab fee. A chemistry lab section with a $200 materials charge. A studio art class that required a supply kit fee paid directly to the department. Courses that existed, that were real, that a student really could be enrolled in, they just weren't classes he would ever attend, and every single one of them came bundled with a fee that would sit on his account as an unpaid balance the second the semester ended and he didn't show up to justify it. An unpaid balance, at that school, meant a hold. No transcripts released. No registration for the following term. No proof of continuous enrollment if anyone came asking for one. It took less than 40 minutes. I remember hanging up the internal line, sliding my headset off, and sitting very still at my desk for a minute, staring at a stack of transcript request forms like they might tell me whether I'd just done something righteous or something monstrous. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like I'd swallowed a stone. But underneath that feeling, quiet and certain, was something that didn't waver. He doesn't get to sit across from her twice a week like nothing happened. I never told anyone what I'd done. Not Renee. Not Talia. Especially not Talia. I went home that night and made dinner like it had been an ordinary Friday, and some part of me has been carrying that Friday around ever since. The following week was the longest week of that entire semester, and nothing about it looked dramatic from the outside. I went to my classes. I clocked into my shifts. I processed other students' add/drop requests with the exact same careful, methodical attention I always had, like my hands hadn't done anything different the week before. I did not pull Derek's file again. I made a rule for myself, the very night I did it, that I would never look at his record again unless I absolutely had to, because looking felt like the kind of thing that would eventually get noticed, and because some part of me understood that the less I touched it, the less real my fingerprints on it would ever be. Talia came over twice that week, same as always, and I sat across from her at dinner both times with this strange, private awareness humming under everything I said. She talked about her classes. She mentioned, once, that she was dreading Tuesday, the English class, the shared room, the seating chart she was certain would put her within eye line of him for an entire semester. I didn't say a word. I passed her the salad. The strangest part of that week was how ordinary everything else in my life insisted on staying. I had a chemistry midterm on Wednesday that I still had to study for, curled up at the kitchen table with flashcards while some part of my brain sat 2 rooms over, running its own separate program, replaying keystrokes I'd already made and couldn't take back. I remember standing in line at the campus coffee cart on Monday behind a group of students complaining about a dropped class, some scheduling snag that had cost them a spot in a popular elective, and feeling my stomach drop 3 full stories before I registered that they weren't talking about Derek at all, just an unrelated, ordinary scheduling headache, the kind that happens by the dozen every single week on a campus that size. I laughed at myself in the coffee line, quietly, at my own paranoia. It didn't make the paranoia go away. Ms. Kowalczyk asked me on Wednesday to help pull a batch of financial aid verification forms, and I sat there sorting through folders with hands that felt too visible, too obviously guilty, even though nothing about the task had anything to do with Derek's file. I kept waiting for someone to ask me a question I didn't have an innocent answer to. Nobody did. The office hummed along exactly as it always had, phones ringing, the printer jamming on schedule, Ms. Kowalczyk complaining good-naturedly about the new semester's parking permit system, and slowly, over the course of that week, I started to understand something uncomfortable about how institutions actually work. They are not designed to notice one quiet, procedurally correct action taken by an employee who has every right to take it. They're designed to catch outliers, spikes, anomalies large enough to trip an alarm. What I'd done didn't look like an anomaly. It looked like Friday. If you're the kind of person who's ever quietly fixed something for someone you love without ever telling them you did it, you know exactly what that dinner felt like. Tell me in the comments. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the moment, because Tuesday is coming. I never found out exactly how the registrar's office handled the aftermath on their end, and I want to be honest that I've spent a long time imagining it, because I never had the nerve to look closely enough to find out for certain. What I do know, because a friend from a neighboring department mentioned it months later without any idea what she was actually telling me, is that Derek's advisor flagged his file sometime after the semester started, when a routine international student compliance check came back showing an enrollment status that didn't match his prior term. There was, apparently, a brief internal review, the kind of quiet administrative churn that happens constantly in any large system and that nobody outside the building ever hears about. A note in a file. A conversation between 2 staff members. Nothing that ever had my name anywhere near it, because as far as the system was concerned, a legitimately authorized employee had processed a legitimate schedule change during the legitimate drop/add window, using the legitimate phone line built for exactly that purpose. There was no broken lock to point to. Just a set of ordinary keystrokes that looked, on paper, exactly like 100 other ordinary keystrokes I made that same week. I spent a solid month flinching every time my supervisor called my name across the office. Nothing ever came of it. Nobody ever came of it. And slowly, the flinching stopped. Talia called Renee the following Tuesday evening, and I could hear her voice from across the room before Renee even said anything, because it had a pitch to it I hadn't heard from her in weeks, high, disbelieving, almost giddy. She told us about the extra body standing in the back of room 214. About Mr. Halloran running his finger down the roster twice. About Derek arguing, in the mild, ineffective way people argue when they don't actually have any ground to stand on, and about the waitlisted freshman sliding into the one open seat while he was still talking. "He's not in the system," Talia said, and I remember the exact particular relief in the way she said it, like she was testing whether the sentence was really true by saying it out loud. "He's not in any system. I don't understand it. It's like he just stopped existing." I sat on our second-hand couch, the same one Derek used to sit stiffly on 3 times before he stopped coming, and I let myself feel, for the first time since that Friday afternoon, something close to satisfaction. Not joy. I want to be precise about that, because joy isn't the right word for what taking something like this away from someone feels like, even when they deserve it. It was more like the specific relief of watching a door close and lock on its own, after you spent a week worrying you'd left it open. She never saw him in that class again. Not everyone in our circle was comfortable with how thoroughly Derek seemed to have vanished from campus that fall, even though none of them knew I had anything to do with it. A mutual friend, a guy named Owen who'd known Talia longer than any of us, brought it up over drinks a few weeks later, not accusingly, just musing out loud the way people do when they're turning something over. "It's weird, right? One day the guy's just gone. Dropped out mid-semester, no goodbye, nothing. You'd think if he really loved her he'd have fought for it a little, tried to make things right instead of just disappearing. Maybe he did try, and it didn't work," Renee said, carefully neutral, and shot me a look across the table that I understood perfectly and answered with absolutely nothing. "Still feels extreme," Owen said. "Whatever happened between them? People don't usually just evaporate like that." I remember taking a slow sip of my drink and saying, honestly, maybe some people need to. Nobody pushed further. But it sat with me for a while, that word, extreme, because I wasn't sure it was wrong. I still turn it over sometimes, even now. Whether what I did was justice, or whether it was just a very patient, very procedural version of revenge dressed up in the language of paperwork. I want to give you the version of this story that doesn't make him a monster with no history, because that's not honest, and because Talia, of all people, is the one who eventually told me the piece that complicated things for me. Years later, we were all in our late 20s by then, long since scattered to different cities. Talia and I ran into each other at a mutual friend's wedding, and somewhere between the reception and the goodbyes, she told me she'd looked Derek up once, out of a curiosity she said she wasn't proud of. He'd grown up watching his own father control every financial decision his mother made, down to the dollar, framing it the whole time as devotion. "I only do this because I love you, because I need to know you're safe." Derek had absorbed that grammar of love before he was old enough to know it wasn't the only one. It didn't make what he did to Talia forgivable. It didn't undo the bruise on her lower back or the year she spent afterward flinching at raised voices. But it made him, for the first time, a person instead of a plot device in my own head, someone who'd learned a broken shape for love long before he ever met her, and never once been given a reason to unlearn it. She told me about it standing near the gift table, both of us holding plastic cups of champagne we weren't really drinking, half watching the dance floor where Renee, who'd also been invited, because our friend group had always been more resilient than our romance, was teaching someone's little cousin an extremely enthusiastic, extremely wrong version of the electric slide. "I looked him up a few years ago," Talia said. "I don't even really know why. Morbid curiosity, I guess. He's married. Lives outside Portland now, from what I could tell. She turned her cup slowly by the stem. I found an old interview his mom gave to some local paper, years before any of this, about a small business she'd tried to start and had to close because his dad controlled every dollar that came in or out of it. Framed the whole thing like protection. Like he was just looking out for her. She shrugged, a small, tired movement. I don't know. I used to think people like that were just born broken. Now I think they're built that way, piece by piece, usually by someone who loved them and didn't know any better. I didn't tell her what I'd done that fall. I've never told her. Standing there, though, I remember feeling the shape of the story shift slightly under its own weight, not softening what he did, not excusing the bruise or the shove or the year she spent flinching at raised voices, but widening the frame just enough to fit a second, sadder story sitting quietly behind the first one. It didn't make me regret what I did. It made me understand, a little better, what I'd actually been up against, not a villain built from nothing, but an ordinary, damaged person who never once got handed a reason to be anything else. I don't tell you this to soften what I did. I tell you because I think it's the only way to tell a true story instead of a satisfying one. I never confirmed everything, and I want to be honest about the limits of what I actually know versus what I pieced together and assumed. What I do know, he never re-enrolled at that school. I checked his record exactly once, almost a year later, against my own rule, because Talia mentioned offhand that she'd heard he'd left the state, and some old, tired part of me needed to see it with my own eyes. His file showed no active enrollment. No unpaid balance either. By then, someone, eventually, must have paid off or written off those fee-laden classes I'd loaded onto his account, or the school's own collections process eventually closed it out the way these things do. I never found a version of the story where he was formally deported, and I've stopped needing one. What I know for certain is that he never sat in a classroom with Talia again, and as far as any of us could ever tell, he never contacted her again either. He tried, once, about 6 weeks after the breakup, showed up outside her building unannounced, the way people do when they're trying to script a reconciliation that was never going to be offered. Talia told us about it afterward over dinner, hands wrapped around a mug of tea like she needed something warm to hold on to while she talked. He'd been waiting by the stairwell when she got back from her evening shift at the campus bookstore, and he'd started in the way he always started, soft at first, apologetic, telling her he'd changed, that dropping out of his classes had been a wake-up call, that he understood now what he'd almost lost. He didn't know, of course, exactly why he'd dropped out. He seemed to genuinely believe it had been some administrative fluke, bad luck, a system error, and some perverse part of me was almost grateful for that, grateful that whatever else this had cost him, it had never once occurred to him that a person had done it on purpose. Talia didn't let him finish. She told him, calmly, that it was over, that she wasn't interested in a version of him that only existed after consequences forced it into being, and that if he came back to her building again she would call the police, not us, not me, the actual police, on her own terms, in her own time, when she was finally ready to use that particular lever herself. She told us her voice hadn't shaken once while she said it. I believed her. I think that steadiness was its own kind of ending, the moment she stopped being someone things happened to, and became someone who decided what happened next. He didn't come back. 12 units. That's the number I keep coming back to, all these years later, in a career that now runs entirely on numbers, compliance thresholds, audit flags, the exact figures that separate in good standing from out of it in systems far bigger and far more consequential than a junior college registrar's office. 12 units was never a punishment I invented. It was already there, built into the architecture of the system, waiting for someone who understood it to use it. I think about that a lot. How the tool I used wasn't clever or illegal in the technical sense. I had legitimate access, I made legitimate-looking changes, during a legitimate window, using a legitimate line. The only thing that made it wrong was that I did it to someone who never asked me to, in service of a decision that was never mine to make. I've made a kind of peace with it. Not a comfortable peace. The kind you make with a decision you'd probably make again, but that you also hope you're never put in a position to have to. If this story reminded you that the people who protect you don't always do it loudly, that sometimes it looks like paperwork, not a fistfight, sit with that for a second before we finish this one. Talia and Derek never spoke again, as far as I know. She finished her degree 2 years later, moved out of state for a job in public health, and the last time we talked, a long, easy phone call on her birthday a few years back, she sounded like someone who'd built a genuinely good life on the other side of a bad year. She's married now, to someone I've met exactly twice and liked both times, mostly because he laughs at her jokes the same slow, delighted way we all used to at that apartment table. Renee and I broke up about a year after all of this, for reasons that had nothing to do with Talia or Derek or any of it, just two 21-year-olds figuring out, gently and without any real drama, that they wanted different versions of their 20s. We're still friendly. She was actually the one who told me, a decade later, that Talia still brings up the semester Derek just disappeared like it's a small, private miracle she's never fully explained to anyone, including herself. Ms. Kowalczyk retired the year after I graduated, and at her going-away lunch, in a room full of student employees she'd trained over 2 decades, she gave a short, dry speech about the importance of treating a student record like it belonged to a person, not a number, that every drop, every ad, every hold code represented somebody's actual life, and that the job only meant something if you remembered that every single time you touched the keyboard. I sat in the back of that room and felt something twist in my chest that I never fully explained to anyone either. She wasn't wrong. I'd just used her own lesson in a direction she never would have sanctioned. I finished my associate's degree, transferred to a 4-year school 2 hours north, and eventually landed, almost too fittingly, in compliance work, first at a regional bank, then at the mid-sized logistics company where I still work today, reviewing internal processes for exactly the kind of quiet, procedurally correct misuse of legitimate access that I myself once committed at 20 years old. There is a version of my career that reads like a very long, very slow act of penance, and I've made a kind of peace with that reading too, even if it isn't the whole truth. Talia and I still talk a handful of times a year, a birthday text, a check-in when something big happens in either of our lives. She sent me a picture last spring of her toddler in a tiny cap and gown from a preschool graduation, captioned only with 3 crying laughing emojis, and I sat there at my desk on my lunch break grinning at my phone like an idiot, thinking about a girl who once sat in our kitchen with a bag of frozen peas pressed against her hip, certain her whole life was about to be rearranged around a man who'd hurt her. It wasn't. It got rearranged around a preschool graduation instead. If there's a lesson in this story, it isn't go get a job with access to sensitive systems and use it to fix your friend's problems. I want to be very clear about that. What I did carried real risk, to my job, to my own record, potentially to people who had nothing to do with any of it, and I got away with it as much through luck and an ordinary bureaucracy's disinterest as through any careful planning on my part. I don't recommend it. I'm not sure I'd do it again, even knowing it worked. What I do believe is this: the reliable ones in every friend group, every family, every workplace, the ones who quietly know how the systems around them actually work, carry more weight than anyone ever gives them credit for, including, usually, themselves. 12 Units was never really about Derek. It was about refusing to let "there's nothing we can do" be the end of the story, when the truth was there was something, it just wasn't loud, and it wasn't going to look like justice on the 6 o'clock news. If this story reminded you of your own quiet reliability, the way you're the one who remembers the deadline, fixes the form, notices the thing everyone else missed, take that as your sign that it's worth more than you think it is. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If this is the kind of story that lands for you, hit subscribe to Behind Closed Doors Revenge, because there are more stories like this one coming: quiet people, ordinary access, and the very specific kind of justice that never makes the news. Follow the channel so you don't miss the next one. And if there's someone in your life who's always the reliable one, the one everybody leans on and nobody thinks to check on, send them this story. They'll know exactly why.